Hey, welcome to the channel. My name's Tyler. Your name is Mike.
Why don't you just go by Mike instead of Michael?
No way. Why should I change? He's the one who sucks.
Recently I made a video on how to draw anything in 3 easy steps, and while that does apply to any subject matter, with hard surface designs and especially vehicles, we need to use a little bit more care because the proportions are so specific. So today I thought we'd take a look at applying that 3-step drawing process to some vehicles. Okay, so as a recap from last time, step 1 is proportion, where we use simple lines and volumes to measure out the proper proportions. And then 2, we add form to that by building it out using simple shapes. And finally, we get to rendering by adding a bit of hatch marks and indication of materials. This time it's going to be similar. Step 1 is still proportion, and you can see that we're going to be doing a side view to measure out our proportions. And step 2 is a little bit different. I'm going to call it rotation, where we start hinting at some perspective, but we're not doing full perspective yet. So it's sort of a shortcut to what comes in step 3, which is doing it fully in perspective with simple shapes in our form. So you can notice that form is now step 3 instead of step 2. And I do the rendering just as part of step 3. You can count it as a step 4 if you want, but the one thing you'll notice with the vehicles is it's 3 different drawings from 3 different angles now, so I just include all of that into step 3. So we're going to start off with a car, and I strongly encourage you to start with an early model of a car, like a Ford Model T or a Ford Model A or something like that, because they're boxier and they're easier to understand and draw. Before we get started, just a quick note on wheels and projecting things around in space. We're going to be using the wheel as our main unit of measurement. So a quick note, circles fit into squares perfectly, and they run tangent, meaning the lines intersect in the center of each side of the square. We'll be using that when we draw this in perspective. The other thing to know is rectangles and squares can be projected around. So if you've got a rectangle, draw an X through it, and then you get the center point of the rectangle. From there, we want to extend the top and the bottom lines, and then you can project a line through the center of the rectangle, and that will give you the center point of this side here. Once we have that, we draw a line from the corner of the box through that center point, and that gives you a mirrored image of that rectangle. So those 2 rectangles are the same. Now we can keep projecting that so that we get the same rectangle over and over and over again. We're going to use this technique to project our wheels around the image. So if we do that on our car now, we've got our ground plane, then we box out the first wheel, draw our X to get the center line, and then we do that projection move, and then we get our wheelbase. So this car is a little bit strange. Typically, there's 3.5 wheels between the 2 wheels. This particular car has 3 in between the wheels. Notice that the front of the engine compartment aligns with the center of the front wheel. That's a key measurement. And now we can also use that square projection technique to measure upwards as well. So if we take a look here, again, the typical measurement is the top of the engine compartment is usually another half wheel up from the wheel. This one looks like it's a little bit higher than that. It's somewhere between a half wheel and like a 3/4 wheel. So it's something kind of like that, between half and 3/4. Now that we have this measurement, what we can do is essentially look at where things fall. So you can see that our windshield begins basically around the end of tire 2. There's not actually a tire there, but what would be a second tire, the end of that is where our windshield begins. Now we can project the back wheel upwards to get our full height of the car. So this one looks like it's about 2.5 wheels tall. And there is a bit of a downslope there on the top of the roof, but I'll just remember that when I draw. I don't really have to note that down. From here, you can make any notes that you want, like this little cut line in the engine compartment falls somewhere around just past the halfway point of that quote-unquote second tire. That's kind of smaller detail stuff. You can do that or not. So now we're actually going to draw this out. I drew it with red on top of the image, but I encourage you to just eyeball it and draw not on top of the image, right? You just use it as a reference and draw separately. This will help train your eye a little bit better. but I want to show you what I'm looking at specifically when I draw this out. So you can see that I'm using those same measurements. There's half a wheel up is the top of our engine compartment. The end of the second wheel is where my windshield begins. And then I just estimated 2.5 wheels up for the top of my roof there. And now we're going to get to the fenders. Now, rounded forms are very hard to draw perfectly the first time. So what we're going to do is start off with a boxier shape. We want to look at certain notes here. The front of the front fender lands somewhere around the front square of our front wheel box, if that makes sense. And then it bottoms out again and becomes flat at the center point of our second wheel, that end of the second wheel where the windshield begins. So we're going to draw that out as a box first with boxier shapes. And then once we have that, then we can chisel it out and round it off. And then from there, it's just smaller detail-y bits. Anything that's in shadow, I just hatch out. And here I'm adding a little bit of fake perspective by indicating the back wheels and a bit of the backside of the cab. Okay, so going into step two has a lot of faking, so I'm going to quickly explain what we're going for. Just stick with me, follow through step 2, and then once we get to step 3, you'll actually understand step 2 better the more of step 3 that you do. So if we take this idea of projecting rectangles and we do it in perspective, our horizontal lines are going to taper together as they move back in space. And then when we project our rectangles, what happens is it still works, it's still the same rectangle, but visually they get smaller and they get narrower. So you can see that the front box and the back box is about half the width of the front one, but it's technically the same, it's just in perspective. So what we want to do in step 2 is we're going to keep the perspective out and keep our horizontal lines straight, but we want to try to replicate that foreshortening that's happening by shortening the width of the wheels as they go back. Because our perspective is flat, if we try to project our boxes back, they're all going to be the same width, but we want to fake this foreshortening. So we're going to be replicating this bottom diagram in the top one. If we look at an example of this, essentially what we're doing is if we had the perspective, it would look something like this box, and we could properly measure it out and the back tire would get foreshortened. But in this view, it's all very flat. We're using a very long lens, so it all looks very flat. So we don't get to measure it out. So it's a lot of guesswork here. So the idea is to draw an ellipse and then they're going to get shorter and shorter as they move back. Because we can't actually measure it out, I'm just shortening them as I go back. I'm just guessing at it. But you can see that I still have my 3 spaces between the tires. Now with the front, again, we have to take a guess at it. If it was in perspective like this, I could measure out, typically the width of a car is about 3 tires wide. So if I had perspective, I could measure that out properly, which we'll see in step 3. But right now, again, I don't have that because I don't have a second vanishing point. It's all flat. So I have to take a guess at where that back tire lands. From there, again, I have to guess at where the center point is to find the center of the front of our car. So we know from step 1 that the front of the engine compartment lands somewhere around the mid tire. So if I look at the center of my 2 tires that I've got and draw an X through it, I get the center. But then again, because of foreshortening, I want to move that center point a little bit further back because the half facing us will appear wider than the backside. You can see in this image here, that's the center of the front of the engine compartment. And these 2 measurements are the same, but the side that's closer to us looks a lot wider. So that's what we're doing in our step 2 drawing. So now we just start drawing out that front facing part of the engine compartment. And now we start looking at the step here. Again, here I have to take a guess. You can see that fender step. I go up from the bottom of the wheel and then left because I'm going inwards towards the center of the car. But I have to guess at where that is because I have no perspective. I can't measure out how wide that tire is, so I'm just taking a guess here. If that confuses you, you'll get to see it in perspective in step 3. And now I want to find the width of my cab. So what I do is I look at the wheelbase on the close side and then compare it to what would be the wheelbase on the far side. And I have to keep in mind that the cab is inwards from the wheels. The wheels basically sit outside of the cab. So I'm essentially imagining all of that as I draw out. So I know that my windshield starts around the second tire, the end of the second tire, but then I'm moving inwards to the left for the close side. And then I'm doing the opposite on the far side, and that's how I get the width of my windshield. And then I noticed that I wasn't paying enough attention to the height of the car, got that wrong, so I just adjusted that. And again, for the back of the car, I have to move inwards a little bit because it's narrower than the wheelbase. And that is basically our key measurements there. So the rest is essentially just detailing. Adding in my fenders there. Again, the back of the fender where it starts to bottom out or go flat is at the end of the second tire. I'm just taking a bit of time to draw out the wheels, and then I can just copy them around. Guessing at the perspective is what makes this step easier and faster, but with guessing, your margin of error goes up. Okay, so as we get into step 3, form, and drawing this in perspective, I want to revisit that circle and the square and what that looks like in proper perspective. So as a review, the circle and the square run tangent at the center of each side of the square. That's still going to be true in perspective. And just as a reminder, we can project that square backwards in space in perspective to get our proper foreshortening. So using those principles, we're going to draw our perfect ellipse in perspective. There's two things you need to get right to get the proper ellipse. One is the correct angle of the minor axis. The second is the degree of the ellipse, or the width of the ellipse. So I start with the front vertical line of my tire, and I figure out the height by adding a ground plane and another line on top going back to the same vanishing point. Now, if we look at an ellipse, we want the minor axis, which is the shorter diameter. What a lot of students get wrong is they'll draw their ellipse wrong. They'll draw it flat like this, with the minor axis just being horizontal, but that's incorrect. With ellipses, the minor axis goes towards the other vanishing point. The minor axis of my ellipse will align with that. On a car, it's easy. It's just the axle between the two wheels. You can think of a Hot Wheels car. They just have one little metal rod that connects the two wheels. That's your minor axis. So I know my minor axis is going to be going back in that direction. I don't know exactly where it's going to fall because I don't know the size of my ellipse yet, but it's going to be something around this. Now the other thing is we need to make sure that our circle hits tangent. That is still true in perspective. So you can see that if we draw this, I'm going to point out that I don't know if this is actually a perfect square, so I don't know if an ellipse will fit in this perfectly. This was just a rectangle when I was doing it. But the general idea is if this is a square, my ellipse, assuming my minor axis is correct, should hit tangent in the center of each square. So when I'm drawing this from scratch, I don't have a lot of the information, but I know it will hit the center of this vertical line. And while I don't know where these points are yet, I know that it'll hit tangent top and bottom around the same spot. And I know the direction of my minor axis. So using those, I can draw an ellipse. And you can see, I think I got it more or less right. And you can see it hits tangent on the top and bottom pretty close. I think they're pretty aligned here. So I think this ellipse is close, maybe not super perfect. And then once I have the ellipse, now I know the width of my square. So that's how to find the proper degree and angle of your tire. So when I'm drawing this out for real, I start off with the front side of the front wheel, meaning the vertical line of the front wheel, and then my ground plane. So I'm looking at the two wheels there to see the angle of that line. And then same thing with the front side. So I start off with that. And then, like I said, find your minor axis, angle, draw out your ellipse, and then that will give you the square. Once you've got your square, you can use that projection technique to move it back so that we get the back tire. Now, ellipses and wheels can make or break your drawing. If you've got a sloppy ellipse, it's going to ruin the drawing even if the rest of it is good, which is why I like to start with the wheels. When you're drawing this with pen on paper, if it's going to go wrong, it's going to be with the tire. So I like to start with the wheels first, and if you screw up, then at least you didn't waste a bunch of time on the drawing. You can just try again. So you can see I'm spending a little bit more time on the wheels here. Once I've got those, you can see I also projected 3 ellipses to the left so that I've got a rough width for my car. And from there, I can measure out center of the wheel to center of the wheel to find the center of my engine compartment. And now this is the point I was talking about in step 2. That fender steps inwards because the cab is narrower than the wheelbase. Now I've got a ground plane, so I can look at the width of my wheel, go inwards on the ground plane, and project upwards, and that's how I get the width of the fender. Whereas in step 2, I couldn't see what the ground plane looked like, so I had to take a guess of how wide it was. But here I can measure it out. Here you can see I do the same thing with the base of my windshield. We know that it ends at the back of that quote-unquote second tire that doesn't actually exist. So if I look at where that is on the fender and then move inwards and then project that upwards, I've got where my windshield should start on the side of the car. Then I can do the same for estimating my center point and the far side of the windshield. All right, and then project the roof back and then building out those fenders with more squared off shapes, and then we can chisel that out and do a more rounded version to make our lives easier. The front part of the fenders and front of the car in general gets a little complicated, so take note of that stuff when you're studying these old cars. Now that's most of our big measurements done, so from here it's mostly just detailing. And I start to hatch out some of those darker areas where, frankly, I don't really know what's going on. Since it's dark in the image, I can just darken that in my sketch as well. So as I said, I like to start with the wheels since it's our main unit of measurement and they're the hardest to draw. So if I'm going to screw up, I want to do it quickly and then I can just restart. But you might want to start with a better picture of what your overall perspective of the object is going to be, and that's totally fine. So another way to do it is you can use one big box to block out overall where your whole car is going to be. And then just start blocking out the simple shapes of like the cabinet and the engine compartment. So in this case, again, because we're using an old car, they're very boxy. So the cab section is just a big rectangle. And then the engine compartment is a bit of a tombstone shape, and it's narrower in the front and then it widens out at the back to meet the cab. So you can draw those out there and then you can add the wheels. That's totally fine, totally up to you. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at doing the same thing with a tank and an airplane. Now I did have all these recorded and I might pepper in some of those shots, but the video is getting very long, so I'm just going to do this as a quick overview. So with the tank, I do it slightly different from the car. With the car, we use the wheel as our main unit of measurement, and I use that everywhere, but I use it a little bit more sparingly with the tank. Instead, I measure out the full height of the tank, as you can see here, and I'm looking for my main big forms. So one is the big rectangle that makes the main body of the tank, and I notice that that falls around the 2/3 of the full height mark. So that's one measurement there. From there, I do measure out the wheels, and that will be the best way, I think, to give me the length of the tank. Now, I don't project them over exactly like I did with the car because there is space in between. You can still totally do that. What you would want to do is measure out the square for the wheel and then add this little bit of space. And then that would be your full rectangle. So you could project that whole rectangle over here. It would get, so your rectangle would have both the wheel and a little bit of space. And so that would get projected over here and then over here, etc. For me, I just did a circle and then I estimated the space between the wheels. So when I did mine, I just gave it a little bit of space. So you can do either one depending on how precise you want to be with it. From there, I'm essentially looking at where things fall and hit one another. So you can see here, if I turn my red line on and off, this line in the barrel essentially hits the same as the front of this compartment here. And that goes down to about the front of my first wheel. So all of that is aligned. So that will help out a lot. The other thing is the main turret compartment here starts around the front of this second tire. By the way, these wheels here are internal ones, so they're closer in. So I'm not really counting those. I'm only looking at the ones that are closer to us. So the front of the turret aligns with the front of our second wheel. And then you can see the back of the fourth wheel is where the back of the turret compartment, this like little extra box is. You're essentially looking for all these measurements. So look for anything that you can possibly find that will help you measure this stuff out. You can see that the tires themselves are about 1/3 of the total height as well. So that's another key measurement that I'm going to be using. So from there, I just drew out my side view, my step 1 side view. And then I did our step 2 rotation method by, again, giving some foreshortening to our wheels. And you can see that the foreshortening gets more and more intense as we move back. So this back wheel here is narrower than this one, and that's because of foreshortening. Again, I just sort of took a guess at how that worked in this particular view because all our horizontals are flat, so we can't really measure it out properly. Okay, so finally, just our third perspective view. Now, I did do a trick here that I'd like to show you with the wheels. Because I drew out my wheelbase and sort of kept this as a template, one thing you can do, it's not perfect, but it gets you pretty close. But if I've got this on a layer, I've already measured these out so that the spacing in between them works. So once you've got that and you've got a perspective grid, you can actually use your distort in Photoshop and just align with your grid. And it will, again, this isn't perfect, but it'll get you pretty close, especially if it works better in 3-point perspective, I find, to make sure that your minor axis is aligned. In 2-point perspective, with your verticals just straight up, it doesn't work quite as well with where the minor axis would align. But this gets you pretty close to where you want to be. And then from there, obviously these are flat. They're supposed to be inset dishes, so they're supposed to go like this. So from there, I just, you have to do some fixing because you're forcing a flat item into perspective. It never really works. And then you want to, give the wheels a bit of width there. So you do something like that. So that's my quick method of doing tires in perspective when you're doing it digitally. If you're using pen and paper, obviously you have to just draw them out. And finally, we have our plane. Now, obviously, we don't have wheels or circles to measure anything out. You could add a circle in here if you want to get, the proper length versus the height and that kind of thing. I just eyeballed it personally. So instead, what I did to get my measurements was I just looked at where things fell. So first thing I did was drew a center line through the middle of the nose, and I drew my front and my back. Then as an experiment, I just cut it in half to see what would happen. And turns out you get this little antenna thing right in the center there. It's also the back of the cockpit. So we know right away that the back of the cockpit is the center point. From there, it turns out there's a lot of thirds. I cut it roughly in about a third is the front of our cockpit. And the tail piece here meets the fuselage at another third at the back. From there, you just want to take a few details. I noticed that from our nose, the top of the plane and the bottom of the plane are about the same width, so it's about halfway. The bottom lowest part of the plane lands basically around here in this segment. And then when it goes up towards the back, it crosses over the center line. So we actually lose that at the back. And it lands sort of halfway up to the top of the fuselage section. So that's what I use to measure it out. Now, when you do the side view, you essentially do the exact same thing, but as you move back into space to the right, these thirds are going to get more and more narrow. And then you just add the form. With a plane, they're basically just cigars, so they're like, you can just add a bunch of little cylindrical forms throughout, and you'll be pretty good to go. Obviously, you have to account for things like the windshield comes further out, so it follows that curvature. You'll also notice that I left out the wings in step 1 and 2 because they're not really needed for this. We're mostly focused on the fuselage, and then we'll just add wings in step 3. And then step 3 is also very similar. As you can see, I drew out my grid again with my thirds. So this is my half point and then all of my thirds. And you apply the same methodology. So you add in your ellipse type forms here to build out your fuselage, and then you just add your wings. So here I look at where they attach to the body, and you can see that I add a rough perspective going to a left vanishing point as well, and that allows me to get the angle for the wings. Okay, now you know how to draw vehicles in 3 easy steps, so go draw some awesome vehicles. Leave a comment below if you've got any questions or any ideas for future content that you'd like to see me cover. If you're the type of person that likes to push buttons, there's buttons around, you can push them. I don't know what they do. Thanks so much for watching. Be good to one another, and I'll see you next time. Okay, bye.
You know, there's nothing wrong with that name.
There was nothing wrong with it until I was about 12 years old and that no-talent ass clown became famous and started winning Grammys.